A good example of the symbolism versus the literalism in the Revelation here has to do with this scripture reading this morning in Revelation 16 and verse 12, where it talks about the River Euphrates and that river being dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. As I mentioned last time, when we talked about the terminology and the geography of the Middle East, that most Christians today believe that when we talk about the River Euphrates, it's talking about the literal River Euphrates being dried up in order to prepare for China to the east of Jerusalem. That is supposed to come and march through a dry riverbed and attack Israel. That's what most Christians believe today. Last time, I read you a statement from a paper called the Independent Star, which came out January 13, 1990, that said that Turkey dug a reservoir and they were allowing the Euphrates River to fill up that reservoir while they worked on the dam and created a plug in the dam so that once they allowed those waters to flow again, at their choice, they could pull that plug out and create a diversion of the River Euphrates so that it won't flow through where it normally flows. And so everything downstream of that dam, they can control anytime they want to control it. And because of this, the majority of Christian scholars today have concluded that soon a massive army from China will come, cross over that dry riverbed and attack Israel. But it seems to me that if China ever does attack Israel, that they would rather send planes and drop bombs or launch missiles from a safer place than to send their men in through a dry riverbed. And by the way, if you know your geography, you know that there's another river that runs parallel to the Euphrates River. It's called the Tigris. And it's only about 15 miles away from Euphrates, and it's nearly as big as the Euphrates River. But the Bible doesn't say anything about drying up the Tigris, does it? In order for China to come through and attack Israel, they'd have to go through that river first. But the Bible doesn't say about that because we're not talking about literal things here in Revelation. We're talking about symbolic and figurative things, and we'll see that as we go along. Turn in your Bibles to Daniel. I hope you enjoy studying the Bible because we're going to be looking at a lot of text this morning. After all, we're not here to listen to entertaining stories, are we? We're here to allow God to speak to our souls and to learn what we need to know to avoid the deceptions of Satan in these last days. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and what? Besieged it. Now this happened in 605 BC. Nothing like this had ever happened before in Jerusalem. And nothing like this had ever happened before to Israel. But it wasn't going to be the last time that it happened. It was during this siege right here that we just read about that Daniel and his 3 friends began their training in the way of the Chaldeans as they were captive of Babylon. Now go to chapter 9 of Daniel, and we'll look at verses 1 and 2. Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. In the 1st year of Dries, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. And so here we see in chapter 1, verse 1, it was Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar that was the king, and they were in control. But now Darius is the king, and he is from the Medes. And so here we have the point in time where Medo-Persia came in, and they conquered Babylon. And right at the very beginning here, the 1st year of Darius. Verse 2. In the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, one thing that popped out at me the other day when I was studying this was that even though Daniel was a very busy man, He was the head of state. But he found time to study the Bible, didn't he? He was studying the prophets of Jeremiah. And he discovered something very interesting here. These 70 years of captivity were just about over, and Daniel knew it. And so his focus was on this prophecy because he wanted his people liberated. Now, let's go to that book of Jeremiah, and we'll read those words that Daniel was studying. Jeremiah 25, and right around verse 8. You know, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Daniel. When Daniel was a young man, Jeremiah was an old man. And the point in time when Daniel was finally studying what Jeremiah wrote, Daniel was an old man, and Jeremiah had passed off the scene. In verse 2, it tells us here who Jeremiah was talking to. Jeremiah the prophet spake unto all the people of Judah and to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, now go down to verse 8. Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, that's speaking of Babylon because they came from the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land, Jerusalem, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, and an hissing, and a what? Perpetual desolations. What does perpetual mean? It means forever, right? It's never going to end. And isn't that a good description? Because of the disobedience of Israel, they have constantly had trouble all the way through. Perpetual desolations, as far as Jerusalem is concerned. And they don't hold on to it even today, not the sacred spot. Verse 10. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the candle. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation. And so now it would be Babylon's turn to be punished, just like Israel was being punished. Saith the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. And isn't that so today? Ancient Babylon is no more, really. I mean, it's not inhabited. God said it wouldn't be, and it isn't today. Just like He said that Israel would be perpetual desolations, and they are. And so, what Babylon did to Jerusalem, God was going to do to Babylon. That's the main message here. Now go over to chapter 29 of Jeremiah and verse 10. Jeremiah 29:10. Don't get bogged down here. Some of this stuff's kind of heavy and it's getting into the history, but it'll all come together in the end. And if you miss what I'm saying now, when I get to talking more about the meaning of what it is to dry up the River Euphrates and to prepare the way for the kings of the east and so forth, you'll miss the point. Jeremiah 29:10. For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished, at Babylon I will visit you, and perform my good word toward you, in causing you to return to this place, and this place being Jerusalem. By the way, what was the main reason why God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed? What was the reason? Chapter 17 of Jeremiah gives the answer as to why God allowed this to happen. Other things happen before a person who knows the truth goes to idolatry. Jeremiah 17, and beginning with verse 19. Thus saith the Lord unto me, go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, whereby the kings of Judah come in, and by the which they go out, and in all the gates of Jerusalem. And say unto them, hear ye the word of the Lord, ye kings of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, that enter in by these gates. Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, neither do ye any work. But hallow ye the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. Now that word burden there simply means things that they were taking out of their houses and going outside the gates and bartering or selling or trading with those people that would come, non-Israelites, that would come to the gate selling their wares. And so on the Sabbath day, they were taking things out, buying things, bringing them back in. This is what was going on here. So it was business as usual on God's holy Sabbath day. Verse 23. But they obeyed not, neither inclined their ear, but made their necks stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction. And it shall come to pass, if ye diligently hearken unto me, saith the Lord, to bring no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day to do no work therein, then shall there enter into the gates of this city kings and princes, sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, and the men of Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain for how long? Forever. That was God's plan A for His chosen people, Israel, that their nation would last forever. And not only that, but that people would come to them for the truth. But is that the way it is today for the most part? No. We have to go out there and find them, don't we? They aren't coming to us and say, "Well, you have such great truth. Would you share it with us?" It's not happening that way. But that was God's original plan. And I believe in some respects that is God's design today. Now look at verse 26. And they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places about Jerusalem and from the land of Benjamin and from the plain and from the mountains and from the south, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices and meat offerings and incense, and bringing sacrifices of praise unto the house of the Lord. So that's what would have happened had they been faithful. And then verse 27 talks about God's plan B. But if ye will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, and not bear a burden, even entering in at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. This happened 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar and his soldiers came in and took Israel away captive. He didn't destroy the temple at first, but because Israel kept being a rebellious people and braced themselves against the authority of Nebuchadnezzar, whom God's prophet said, "You're going to serve him, you might as well go peacefully because, this is what's going to happen." But no, they braced themselves against it. And because they were rebellious, they wouldn't have listened to the authority of the king, he went back 20 years later and he leveled Jerusalem and the temple. All because, what? They were carrying burdens in and out of the city on the Sabbath day. That was the basis of the problem back then. When I was a new Christian, I can remember going to a evangelistic series of meetings. I can remember he drilled one thing into us. And I remember he said, and he backed this up by illustration after illustration after illustration. He said, God says what He means, and He means what He says. Jerusalem found out the hard way that God says what He means, and He means what He says. And never forget this point. The Sabbath was the focal point of ancient Israel's apostasy. And it will also be the focal point of modern Israel's apostasy in these last days. Okay, back to Daniel's discovery of Jeremiah's time prophecy now. 70 years after Israel was taken captive by Babylon, God said that He was going to liberate Israel and send them back to Jerusalem. That's what we read. How is He going to do it? Go to Jeremiah 51, and we'll find out how He did it. and beginning with verse 60. Jeremiah 51:60. So Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written against Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Sariah, when thou comest to Babylon, and shalt see, and shalt read all these words, then shalt thou say, O Lord, thou hast spoken against this place to cut it off, that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. And it shall be, when thou hast made an end of reading this book, that thou shalt bind a stone to it, and cast it in the midst of Euphrates. And thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. A massive wall surrounded Babylon. And entering at one end of Babylon and exiting at the other end was the great river Euphrates that flowed right through the middle of Babylon. And at each end there were gates that closed off the city. And those gates went right down to the riverbed. And even though the Babylonians believed that their city was impregnable, God said it was going to fall. And it was going to fall suddenly. Now, turn over to Jeremiah 51, same chapter, verses 6 through 9. Jeremiah is telling Israel what they need to do. Verse 6, 51:6. Flee out of the midst of Babylon, and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense. 51:7. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand. Remember those words. That made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her. Take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go every one into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies. Now, doesn't that sound a lot like God's description of Babylon in Revelation 18? Come out of her, my people. Her sins have reached to heaven. Come out so that you don't partake of her sins. See, here we have the same thing happening in the Old Testament is going to happen in the future. Earlier we read just back, I think it was in verse 63, he was to bind a stone around those words and cast it into the river, and it would go to the bottom of the sea, and thus shall it not rise from the evil that is brought upon her. So this Babylon in Revelation cannot be talking about literal ancient Babylon, because God said it was gone down and it wouldn't rise again. That was it for ancient Babylon. Now, it sounds very familiar in these verses here as in Revelation 18, and it's that way for a purpose because there's a parallel here. Speaking of Babylon, in Revelation 18:4 and 5, it says, come out of her, flee out of the midst of her. As Jeremiah said, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And we'll talk a little bit more about the coming out of modern Babylon in a few minutes. But first I'd like you to go to Daniel chapter 5, because there we're given the account of how Babylon fell. Daniel chapter 5, and we'll be beginning right at the beginning in verse 1. Daniel 5, verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, back there in 605 BC, that the king and his princes and wives, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Now that was going too far. That was going too far, and they would pay the consequence for their actions here. Verse 3, Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed. In other words, he sobered up real quick. And his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. Now, if you don't know, that's Bible talk for being scared. He was scared here. And you know the rest of the story. What happened afterwards? He called in all his wise men to see if they could read the writing on the wall, and none of them could do it. And then he finally called Daniel in, because he'd heard stories about Daniel. And Daniel came in, and before reading the interpretation, he gave the king a little history about what his father went through. And then in verse 25 of the same chapter, it says, Daniel interpreting the dream, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Probation closed for Belshazzar and his 1,000 lords. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. You think that's what Daniel wanted? No way, because he knew what was going to happen in just a little while to Belshazzar in the kingdom of Babylon. In that night, same night, was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Dries the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. While Belshazzar and his 1,000 lords were celebrating and drinking the wine of Babylon, their end was very near, and they didn't even know it. And the parallel is there today, isn't it? More than 100 years before what we just read happened, God made a prediction about Babylon and the Euphrates. And for the rest of the story, we'll have to go to Isaiah 45. Isaiah 45. And verse 1. Isaiah 45, 1. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that what happened to Belshazzar? His loins were loosed, and his knees smote one. That's the prediction here of what God said to Cyrus was going to accomplish. I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the 2-leaved gates. The gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Those 2 gates that were on either side of the city of Babylon that allowed the Euphrates to flow through. Says they were going to be not shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. In other words, God was going to prepare the way for Cyrus to accomplish his will. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places. Wasn't Babylon a spiritually dark place? And wasn't it rich? And that's what Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians inherited from Babylon. God said it was going to happen. And for what reason? That thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, Cyrus, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. Now, do you suppose that Daniel read this prophecy to Cyrus after he had conquered Babylon and was already in there? Yes, he did. He did. And wouldn't it make an impression upon you if you were Cyrus? And somebody came up to you and read to you something that was written 150 years before you were born, that told what your name was going to be and the things that you were going to do? I'm sure it made an impression upon Cyrus, and it helped him later on to make a decision to set Israel free and to help them rebuild the temple in Jerusalem that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. Now go over to verse 13 in the same chapter. Isaiah 45:13. Still speaking about Cyrus here. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for price nor reward, saith the Lord of hosts. Cyrus was a type of Christ. Did you know that? He was a type of Christ. You see what it says here? I have raised him up in righteousness. Wasn't Jesus raised up in righteousness? Yes. Did God direct all his ways? Yes. He shall build my city. You know what a city is in Bible prophecy? The church. Who is it that builds the church? Jesus. He's the one who is the head of the church. It's his church. He shall let go my captives. Isn't that the work of Christ? He has come down here to this world, and he has liberated us from the bondage of sin and control of Satan. He set us free. Not for price nor reward. Does Jesus charge us a price for salvation? No. It's a free gift. It's a free gift. And he does it because he loves us. Go to chapter 44 of Isaiah now. Just back a page. Isaiah 44, verses 27 and 28. In verse 27 here, speaking of the Euphrates. That saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. Verse 28, speaking of Cyrus. That saith of Cyrus, he is my what? Shepherd. Wasn't Jesus the good shepherd? And shall perform all my pleasure. Didn't Jesus perform all the pleasure of his heavenly Father? He said, I always do those things that is pleasing in his sight. So here again, Cyrus is a type of Christ. In the first verse of chapter 45 that we just read a minute ago, it says, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, unto Cyrus. You know what anointed means? Well, it means Messiah. It means Messiah. Not that Cyrus was the Messiah, but he was the deliverer that came and delivered his people from the captive of the Babylonians. And Jesus is, of course, the anointed. Down in verse 3 and 4, it says that Cyrus was going to be called by name. In other words, God knew his name before he was even born. What about Jesus? Was he named before he was born? Thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. When Jesus comes back, from what direction will he come? From the east. What direction did Cyrus come from to deliver Babylon? Well, he came from the east too. Go over to chapter 46 of Isaiah there, and we'll start with verse 9. This is talking about God's judgments upon Babylon as Media-Persia conquered it with Cyrus at the head of the army. Verse 9, Isaiah 46. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Have you ever connected those verses with the story of Cyrus? Because that's the context. That's the context. Look at verse 11. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man, Cyrus, that executeth my counsel from a far country, yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. And he came as a ravenous bird of prey, and he descended upon Babylon, and it fell suddenly, just like that. And this is also symbolic of what Jesus will do as he descends upon modern Babylon in the not too distant future at the end of time. Now, I'm going to read something to you from a book titled Exploding the Israel Deception. I don't know if you've ever heard that book before, but I recommend that you get it and read it. Anyway, it's a good book and I recommend it. Here's what it says on page 97. Inside the British Museum in London lies the famous Cyrus Cylinder. It describes how Cyrus, a general of Dries, conquered Babylon. Cyrus and his army dug trenches upstream alongside the River Euphrates by diverting the water. The river gradually went down as it ran through the city of Babylon. No one noticed. At night, at the height of Belshazzar's drunken feast, the water became low enough for Cyrus and his men to quietly slip under the double doors, which had been left open. Quickly, they overran the doomed city, killed the king, and conquered Babylon. And then Cyrus issued a decree to let Israel go. And you can read about that in the first chapter of Ezra, how he made a decree right there at the beginning, at the end of that 70-year prophecy that we read about in Jeremiah. He was the one who set Israel free. Now, here's an important principle. The book of Revelation, when it uses the events and the geography and the terminology and even in some instances men like Cyrus, Revelation then takes those things and applies them to Jesus, not literally to Cyrus. It applies it to the Israel of God or spiritual Israel and not Israel in the flesh. It applies it to modern or mystery Babylon instead of ancient Babylon. And if we miss that point, if we miss that principle, as we study Revelation and try to figure all these things out, it's not going to make any sense to us if we don't understand that principle, that God is using the terminology of the old and symbolically referring to what is going on in the world today. It doesn't have anything to do with the literal Middle East at all. Now turn to Revelation 17, and we will wrap this up and put a bow on it. It'll make it all make sense here. Revelation chapter 17, and we'll begin with verse 1. And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore, that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw the woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand. Isn't that interesting? It said in Jeremiah that Babylon was the golden cup in God's hand. Babylon was what God used to punish His people. And so, in these last days, this mystery Babylon is still claiming to be used of God to punish His people. Aren't we told that in the last days that they would kill you, Jesus said, and think they're doing God's service? This is what's going to happen. And in this cup is full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Not a very pretty picture, is it? And so in verse 3, one of the first things I want you to notice is it says that, so he carried me away, what? In the Spirit. And so we must be in the Spirit if we're going to understand this prophecy. Another thing I want you to notice. It says that Mystery Babylon sits upon many waters. But Mystery Babylon is not the same as ancient Babylon in the Middle East that sat on the many waters of the Euphrates River. What does it say in verse 15 that those waters were? Of chapter 17 in Revelation. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues. These waters represent people around the world that support the falsehoods and the deceptions of Mystery Babylon the Great. They are intoxicated with the wine of Babylon. In a spiritual sense, John in Revelation 14:8, where it talks about the second angel's message, come out of her, my people. Also in Revelation 18:4, where it says the same thing, Babylon is fallen, come out of her, my people. John is simply echoing the words of Jeremiah in the Old Testament when he said, flee Babylon, come out of her, my people. Now, a woman in Bible prophecy represents what? A church. If you haven't discovered that, look at Jeremiah 6:2 and Isaiah 51:16. It makes it very clear that God likens His people or His church unto a comely woman. And there are other passages in the Bible as well that would back that up. So the church of Christ is called His wife, who makes herself ready for the marriage supper of the Lamb. And the woman that is called Mystery Babylon is an apostate Christianity that has fallen away from true Bible teaching. A church that has divorced itself from Christ and is now leading peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues away from Him who is the way, the truth, and the life. Now, inside Mystery Babylon, there are many true Christians that are there. Isn't that so? If it wasn't, God wouldn't say, come out of her, my people. My people. And so God sees them as a part of spiritual Babylon, but they're confused about spiritual things. Isn't that what Babylon means? Confusion. They are confused. They are living up, just like I said earlier, they're living up to all the light that they know, and God takes all that into account, and they are just as much His people as you are, and that I am. But we know something that they don't know. And we are to give the call, right? Come out. Come out of her, my people. We're to give that call. And that call is going forth now. According to our scripture reading there in Revelation 16 and verse 12, what is it that dries up the Euphrates River? What does that mean? It tells you what does it right in the verse itself, if you'll read it again here. 16 verse 12. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Now, what is it that dries up the great river Euphrates? I just read it. It is the wrath of God that does the drying up of the great river Euphrates. It is not Turkey, the literal nation of Turkey, who stopped the flow of the river Euphrates for a month while they had built a concrete plug in the dam so that they could divert those waters at will. The whole Christian world believes that that's going to happen sometime in the future. Now, all these things are in place, they think. See, they can see that all this time, this is what we thought was going to happen. Now we see it all coming together. But it's a big deception. It's a diversion. Talk about a diversion of the river. It's Satan's diversion to keep God's people off track, to keep the whole Christian world off track, instead of focusing on the things that we need to be focusing on today. And so, what does it mean to dry up that river Euphrates? when all the people and the multitudes and the nations and the tongues that have supported modern spiritual Babylon right through to the bitter end, in spite of warning after warning after warning to come out, when after experiencing the wrath of God in the first 5 plagues, because this we're talking about now is during the 6th plague, after experiencing those first 5 plagues, they will finally come to the realization, too late, that they have been deceived. Their support for Babylon is going to dry up, just like the River Euphrates in the Old Testament. All that support is going to dry up. It's going to cease to flow, just like the River Euphrates ceased to flow. When the whole Christian world that is supporting this spiritual river that feeds Mystery Babylon is going to dry up. And they're going to finally figure out that they've been duped. But it's going to be too late. And then what happens, according to verse 12? When that river dries up, when they finally figure out what has happened, then the way of the kings of the east are prepared. Now, let me do just a little recap here. Cyrus came from the east, did he not? To conquer ancient Babylon. We read it just a little while ago. The word east means sun rising. And the name Cyrus means sun, S-U-N. And so Cyrus was a type of Christ, and Malachi 4:2 calls Jesus the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N, of righteousness. So he was a type of Christ. In Matthew 24:27, Jesus said, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." And so we know that Jesus is coming from the east. In Revelation 19:14 through 16, it tells us that the armies of heaven are going to follow Jesus when he comes back to this earth. In verse 16 it says, "And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." In Revelation chapter 8 in verse 1, speaking of the 7th seal, it says that there was silence in heaven for about the space of half an hour. In prophetic time, a half hour is about a week. Why is there silence in heaven? Because there's nobody there. There's nobody there. The kings of the east are on their way back to this earth to conquer Mystery Babylon the Great and to deliver spiritual Israel at Armageddon. That's it in a nutshell. That's what's going to happen. We're in a spiritual battle, aren't we? It's a spiritual battle, and it will continue to escalate until Jesus brings an end to it with his second coming. When that happens, what side are you going to be on? We need to be on his side, don't we? The way to be on his side then is to be on his side now, and to remain on his side continually, and living this life like Jesus lived it, without giving in to temptation, without yielding to those temptations. Instead, we submit to God. And I've said this before, and I really believe it. The more I think about it and the more I study it, perfection of character is a very simple thing. It really is. Perfection of character is submitting to God rather than yielding to temptation every time it comes to you. That's it. We'll never be more perfect than that. Never. See, we have fallen flesh. And we will always have fallen flesh until God comes back and changes us. Then we'll have holy flesh. I've heard it said so many times, that sanctification is a work of a lifetime. That's true. But how do we interpret that? There are many people that think that we are getting better and better. We are sinning less and less. And pretty soon, we will be mature enough to stop. That's never going to happen. The way it is a work of a lifetime is that we need to submit to God today, and we need to do that the rest of our life. That's how it becomes a work of a lifetime. And that's all perfection of character is. That's it. That's it. It's so simple. And so if we get to heaven, it's not going to be by accident, is it? It's not going to be by accident. It will be because we made Jesus first and last and best in everything. And so let's do that today and every day until He comes to deliver His people. That's my prayer.